Hi, it's your host, Jules. Let's go. Hi, everybody. Welcome. This is Jules with your host, Jules True Crime. I am happy you're here because today's case is wild. Have you heard of the biggest and unsolved skyjacking of an airplane in our nation's history? If you have not, hang on, get aboard, because this is one wild ride. And I think it's definitely a great break from the gruesome true crime cases which circulate out there so often. I think this is a great story to dive into and become a little obsessed with trying to figure out what happened. So join me as we dive into the unsolved skyjacking by D.B.Cooper. As the rest of the country was settling in and finalizing holiday meals, a man in his mid 40s with unremarkable features, yet a quiet and steady demeanor, walks through the Portland International Airport. It's Thanksgiving Eve, November 24th, 1971. He approaches the ticket agent at Northwest Orient Airlines and requests to purchase a one-way ticket to Seattle aboard Flight 305. This is just a mere 25-minute journey in the air. Now, the Boeing 727 holds the man and 36 other passengers. He is kindly served a bourbon and soda, but before settling in for the rest of the flight, he brings a briefcase to his lap and calls over to the stewardess once again. And what she witnesses next will not only change the course of this flight, but her life. For everyone on board is about to become involved in the most notorious unsolved flight hijacking in American history. Her eyes glance into the man's case and widen as she realizes what she is seeing: a bomb. She takes a seat as instructed and then signals to the other flight attendant, the young new girl, Tina, Tina Mucklow, and tosses the note to the floor. She then tells Tina, "You dropped something." Tina, already confused as to why Florence is sitting down with a passenger, picks up the note to read, quote, "Miss, I have a bomb here and I would like for you to sit by me," end quote. Tina later recounts to Rolling Stone magazine that she, quote, "instinctively reached for the phone beside her and told the pilots what was happening. They were being hijacked, that this was not a joke," end quote. Now, I think what she does next is very brave, and I'd like your opinion as well. This is what she does, you guys. And remember, she's pretty young. Okay, she's the youngest crew member. She's the newest one of all three attendants and all three pilots. She approaches Dan Cooper and Florence, and she takes Florence's seat. Florence has just finished writing out Cooper's demands, and she has to take it to the cockpit for the pilots. Now, either Tina or Cooper initiate for her to sit down. There are differing reports. Either he tells her to sit or she asks to sit. Well, Tina sits, and it's from that moment on that she becomes Cooper's point person. Tina tells Rolling Stone magazine, quote, "I was there for the hijacker to kind of keep him feeling saved, reassured, comfortable, and not detonating that bomb," end quote. So, what were Cooper's demands? Okay, let's go over them. $200,000 in $20 bills by 5 o'clock p.m., two front parachutes, two back parachutes, and a fuel truck waiting on the ground in Seattle. By the way, $200,000 in 1971 is equivalent to about $1.48 million today. Now, based on those demands, we know he has no intent on deboarding the plane from the ground. The flight to Seattle was just 30 minutes, but the plane holds a pattern over Puget Sound for over 2 hours, with co pilot Bill Radicek announcing to the other passengers that they had to burn off some fuel before landing. However, the real reason was that below them at the airport, government officials were scrambling to meet the demands of Cooper. In addition to that, the government had instructed them to not fly in a pattern over the airport in case the bomb explodes. They wanted to prevent the plane and the people from falling from the sky onto people below. Now, it's important to remember that this event takes place in the 1970s, a time where there was not a do not negotiate modus operandum. In fact, planes were often hijacked in the mid 1960s through the 1970s. Did you know that? That's something I learned while doing this. And that's That number is actually 159 planes, which were hijacked to be exact, with 85 of those planes being diverted to Cuba. Now, it's because of that cockpits had maps of Cuba seas in preparation for flying to Cuba and then flying back, because most of the hijackings were done by Cubans who were wanting to get back home to Cuba but couldn't because of the United States embargo on Cuba. These were not known to be violent skyjackings, just ways to get home. Now, it is because of the frequency of these skyjackings during that time that the US government made skyjackings a federal crime. Smithsonian Magazine reports that what they wanted to avert the loss of life. Quote, officials wanted to downplay hijackings as much as possible, and the best way to do this was to simply give the hijacker what they wanted to avert the loss of life, end quote. Now, this was during a transition for airlines and air travel, where we once had airlines treating passengers as welcome guests, will slowly emerge into treating them like suspects. And it all begins with these skyjackings. On a publicity side, it absolutely wouldn't help air travel if passengers were not treated well. But I guess today we give that up for some sense of security and safety. And because we don't really have many options unless we fly private, do we? Now, with the passengers unaware of the dire situation that they're in, our brave young flight attendant Tina is praying over them, over her family, since she believes that she will die. And she also says she prayed over Cooper. She says that after her prayer, she felt calm and she felt that she had a job to do to keep the skyjacker, Cooper, calm. Now, once the plane lands in Seattle, two other flight attendants are able to get off the plane while it's being refueled. And Cooper agrees to exchange all the passengers for the items he demanded. Tina is sent out of the plane to retrieve Cooper's demands, and subsequently has to make multiple trips on and off the airplane. Now, once everything is loaded on board, Tina, along with Cooper and the two pilots in the cockpit, are ordered to fly low and slow to their next destination, Mexico City. Now, this leaves Tina alone with Cooper and the two pilots in the cockpit remaining, headed to Mexico City with one necessary stop in Reno, Nevada for fuel. Dan Cooper, in his nice suit and dark sunglasses, escorts Tina to the back of the plane where he demands she show him how to open the back stairs. Mid flight, at the low altitude of 10,000 feet, she does as he asked, and after about 5 minutes, he informs her that she may return to the cockpit with the rest of the crew. Tina later recalls that the last words she spoke to Cooper as being a plea to take the bomb with him when he left. Now we find ourselves at the airport in Reno, Nevada, in one piece, having landed safely, only to search the plane and discover that Dan Cooper is indeed missing. And you'll never guess where Cooper was found. And that's because to this day, this event remains the only unsolved skyjacking case in American history. He was never found. What he did leave behind on the plane, though, was his snap on tie, two of the parachutes, and eight cigarette butts. I found on biography.com that, quote, the FBI described Cooper as a white male, 6 foot 1 inch tall, 170 to 170 pounds, age mid 40s, olive complexion, brown eyes, black hair, conventional cut, parted on the left, end quote. Of course, the first thing that we think of when we hear about the cigarette butts is DNA. What about the DNA? Well, DNA testing technology was not available until the 1980s. This is interesting. So, I found a website dedicated to searching for D.B. Cooper titled citizensleuths.com, The Hunt for D.B. Cooper. And it is actually a team of citizen scientists who have come together and they have become the Cooper Research Team. And they've conducted research during a 3 year effort. They were coined citizen sleuths by former Special Agent Larry Carr. Now, it consists of three main people, but we have aided in the efforts to research deeper into DB Cooper. And it was, in fact, a member of this team which studied the elements on the money found to determine the origins. How cool is that? But what about the cigarette butts? The team relays that the cigarette butts are not in a known location. What? Where are the cigarette butts? Well, I found some interesting topics to ponder in the FBI archives per the Freedom of Information Act. Now, here are some things that we need to discuss. His clothes. D.B. Cooper was in a suit, dress shoes, and was not prepared for any type of rough landing or terrain after. And the locations he could have possibly jumped out of the plane into were all heavily wooded areas. His parachute. These weren't the type of parachutes that could be steered. It was you jump, you pull, you pray. You had no control over where to navigate the landing once you jumped. Remember, he jumps into the dark night sky as well, and it's just after 8 p.m. I am really curious if the money was marked. And it was. It was actually marked. So the serial numbers were documented. And this is how authorities were able to confirm the only known discovery of about $6,000 of the missing money. Here's how it was discovered. In 1980, a young boy named Brian Ingram was camping with his family just north of Vancouver, Washington. Now, he went to dig a fire pit when he found a package filled with three stacks of $20 bills tied with rubber bands. History.com shares that, quote, 6 years after he discovered the money, Ingram was allowed to keep $2,760 of it. In 2008, he sold 15 of the fragmented $20 bills at auction for $37,433.38, end quote. Where do we go from here? Well, nobody really knows, but some scientists are still trying to figure it out. And they're doing so by eliminating some theories with the use of science. By analyzing the algae that was on the money, they were able to pinpoint which season the money would have been exposed to the water. Now, I will link the article in our show notes on our website for anyone who wants to dig deeper and geek out along with me with the specifics. But it's a type of science that I love. Almost sneaky forensics, like the people who study bugs and decomposing bodies to determine the origin of death type of way. It's very interesting science, and it's very much needed to help bring people to justice. But back to the theories, because we do have a lot more to go through. So stay with me here, okay? I had to sift through them and pick out the ones I thought would be the most interesting to share with you. But it's worth noting that the FBI shares on their website that they have had over 800 suspects for DB Cooper. Why was he named D.B. Cooper? We know he purchased his ticket as Dan Cooper. So, where the heck did the DB come from? Well, according to the FBI, it originated from an incorrectly printed newspaper article and it stuck. So, really, it should be Dan Cooper. But here we are years later, and it's still DB Cooper to everybody else. So, how was DB Cooper able to jump from the plane with $200,000 in $20 bill bundles? Well, according to the Netflix documentary, DB Cooper, Where Are You? It would have weighed at least 20 pounds. And to parachute with that, and recall that he is in dress clothes and dress shoes in the dark in the middle of a wooded area. One question that the same documentary raised was if all the money actually really did leave the plane with DB. There are so many theories, and it's a case which would certainly bring fame to whomever was to crack it. After all, hundreds of investigators, police officers, and the FBI have dedicated countless man hours and funds into trying to uncover who D. Cooper really was. So, what's the allure? Don't you think it almost has a super spy James Bond type of fictionalized element? I do, especially when you think of a man jumping from a plane without having hurt anybody with the threat of an alleged bomb. And he's in a nice suit with slicked back hair and he was polite to all of the staff. It definitely has a very fictionalized spy James Bond type of element. Lots of stories have been fictionalized over time, like Bonnie and Clyde. We have this man who is almost a character and poof, he disappears. But what if I told you that there was a government plane trailing Flight 507 as it rerouted to Reno to refuel with Cooper on board? This means that Cooper jumped out of the plane and even evaded the trailing plane. That's right, the trailing plane did not know that Cooper had jumped either, which adds another insane element to this story. So, where did he actually depart? When did he actually jump from this plane? Now, since the crew are not certain, remember, they were all sequestered into the cockpit. There's two pilots and the flight attendant, Tina. Now, they can only go off of theories. One theory is that Cooper jumped at a point where there was a change of pressure, which was noted in the plane. This is called the pressure bump theory. Basically, it says that when the plane had a bump in pressure at 8:13 p.m., that it was actually Cooper leaving the plane. The time was noted when the crew felt a jolt and agreed that it was likely Cooper. Based off the location of the plane, the speed it was traveling, the wind speed, the elevation of the ground below, and the time of the bump, experts worked to pinpoint where they believed Cooper would have landed and where he had actually jumped when the crew felt the bump. So I actually found an interesting theory by Gregory Smith in an article from 2016 called D.B.Cooper New Theory for the Cause of the Pressure Bump on Flight 305. And was that it was actually a diversion by Cooper, who jumped up and down on the door to cause the plane to repressurize and cause the bump to sound like he jumped, when in all actuality, he was still on the plane hiding the entire time. Then, once they arrived in Reno, he simply snuck off and hid the money, hitchhiked out of Reno, and returned later to get his money with a rental car. Okay, here's an overview of information the FBI collected from witnesses aboard the plane. Cooper bought his ticket with a $20 bill using the name Dan Cooper at the airport ticketing terminal. He ordered a bourbon and soda before the flight took off, standard flight procedure to take orders. He smoked Raleigh cigarettes and collected his matches after. So, as I was researching this case, I realized the infinite rabbit holes that I could go into with Cooper theories. In fact, there are even Cooper conventions filled with people so curious about the case. Absolutely would love to go to one. I do believe this is so fascinating. I could see myself becoming a Cooperite because of how intriguing this case is. Now, the FBI released over 300 pages of documents from their investigation, which I'll be sure to link in our show notes in this episode for anyone who wants to geek out alongside me. Something that stayed with me from the documentary D.B. Cooper, Where Are You? Was an interview with a former chief of disguise, Jana Mendez, who said that the first thing when disguising is to flip everything around you that you see. So Cooper allegedly had shiny black hair, right? With her theory, it would have been dyed dark. He had a nice suit, something that Cooper would not typically be wearing. Don't look for the obvious, but rather look for the opposite. Now, there have been a few key suspects over the years, and I realize I told you earlier there were 800 suspects named over the years, but let's talk about the few key because we can't cover all of them. I will be introducing and analyzing why a few of these suspects actually make really strong candidates for having been D.B. Cooper. So let's talk about two of them. Two of my favorite picks for D.B. Cooper. Number one, Robert Rackstraw. Born in 1943, this guy has so many people convinced he was D.B. Cooper to the point that his own sister was interviewed for the documentary, D.B. Cooper, Where Are You? And she said it would be very believable that he was indeed Cooper. So here's what makes Robert Rackstraw a great candidate for Cooperites/Cooper sleuths. He was a mischievous kid who grew up getting into trouble until he found the military. And it seemed to really click for him. He found his place. He would volunteer for the riskiest missions, and coincidentally, the same year D.B. Cooper hijacked the airplane, Rackstraw was discharged from the military for forging records and documents. He became very angry against the military and government. What convinces people Rackstraw was D.B. Cooper? He was a paratrooper with the United States Army. He had a criminal record for things such as check fraud and domestic violence and falsifying military records. He was discharged for the latter after serving in Vietnam, which many theorists believe was his motivation for the skyjacking. Now, this is interesting. Rackstraw was charged with the murder of his stepfather, Philip Rackstraw, but was eventually acquitted by a jury. Here's what happened. Rackstraw goes into business with his stepfather. This was an act of kindness on Philip's behalf. He was the late husband of Robert Rackstraw's mother. She had died of cancer years prior, yet Philip was still looking out for her sons. And it's soon discovered that Rackstraw is doing unethical and shady business dealings, even stealing from their customers. Philip was headed to the business account with a bundle of receipts, but he never makes it. He goes missing. And when pressed about where Philip went, Robert's stepfather and business partner, Robert tells his brother that Philip went to Hawaii. Robert's brother, rightfully so, hires a private investigator, and the investigator doesn't believe for a hot second that Philip is in Hawaii. He sends Robert's brother to walk the property and search for any suspicious looking areas, plots of land that seem to have been disturbed recently. And what do you know? Philip's body is discovered buried on the property with a bullet in the back of his head shot from behind, not in Hawaii. And now Robert is charged with the murder, which seems like a very open and shut case. However, listen to what he does. He rolls up to the trial. I mean, he literally rolls up. The man is in a wheelchair. Does he use a wheelchair? No. It was all part of a scheme to play on the jury's emotions. Robert's presenting himself as a son in mourning for his stepfather, vowing to find out who did this to him, and he goes on to share about his war accolades and medals, which, according to the site The Cinemaholic, is later revealed to be mostly lies. Well, it works, and the jury acquits him. But his schemes won't stop there. Rackstraw would later face more charges for check fraud and decides to disappear for himself by way of faking his own death. He flies a plane, sends out a distress call over Monterey Bay in California. Now, searchers were never able to locate him, and that's because he flew his plane back to a hangar and he repainted the plane and he changed the serial numbers. He was later found in Fullerton, California, alive and well. He was sent to prison and seemed to have carried on a life more on the straight and narrow after that. Now, the San Diego Tribune notes that, quote, in 1991, he had earned an economics degree from the University of San Francisco, 2 decades after getting kicked out of the Army for faking college transcripts, end quote. He died in July of 2019. The biggest reason why he was ruled out as a suspect by the FBI? He was only 28 in 1971, and eyewitness reports aged D.B.Cooper to be in his 40s. Now it's time for our second top suspect. His name is Kenneth Christensen. You'll recall that the airline that D.B.Cooper hijacked was a Northwest Orient airplane. Kenneth Christensen was a mechanic, a flight attendant, and purser for the same airline. A purser, for those who don't know, is someone who is basically in charge of the flight crew. The team lead helps organize the gate personnel and assigns the duties. Sometimes a purser can be charged of the safety aboard the flight as well. So he'd have access, knowledge, and guess what? Just 1 year after the D.B.Cooper skyjacking, Kenneth purchased a home with cash, which raised red flags because none of Kenneth Jobs' titles offered that kind of money to do so. In 2003, Kenneth's brother Lyle watches a documentary on D.B. Cooper and immediately suspects that his late brother Kenneth was a mystery skyjacker. What was his proof? Okay, here we go. He was an Army trained paratrooper. Kenneth worked for Northwest Orient Airlines and based in Seattle at the time of the skyjacking. He was about the same age as the eyewitnesses estimated D.B. Cooper to be. He was 45. Kenneth smoked, like Cooper reportedly did during the flight, and he favored bourbon, like Cooper's drink of choice. But here's what could rule him out: no direct evidence linking him to the infamous skyjacking. He was shorter than the reports of Cooper, and he was thinner. So I know I said just two suspects, but I do have a treat for you because I couldn't stop myself from nerding out. I have one more suspect. I would be beside myself if it didn't include Lynn Doyle Cooper in this episode. That's right, Cooper. Lynn Doyle Cooper, born 1939 and died 1999. Listen to this. Lynn Doyle Cooper's niece, Marla Cooper, tossed Lynn Doyle Cooper's name into the pool of names in 2011. She provided the following reasons for her theory that her uncle was indeed D.B. Cooper. She recalls how her uncle was obsessed with a Canadian comic book hero called Dan Cooper, even having a cover of the comic hanging on the wall in his home. Now, her uncle was not a paratrooper, nor had he had any parachuting experience or training. Yet the comic book was centered around the sky jumper, Cooper. Now, this one is compelling. While visiting her grandmother's home, Marla heard Lynn and another uncle scheming some sort of plan which involved high tech walkie talkies. She says the next day that they went hunting, yet her Uncle Lynn returned home bloody and beaten, which he then claimed was from a car accident. And Marla and her parents grew suspicious as it was the same day as D.B. Cooper's skyjacking. Marla's grandmother's house was just 150 miles from Portland. And Marla's mother relayed to her that she always thought her uncles were the ones responsible for the skyjacking. This prompted Marla to really dig into her memories, and as she researched more and more details began flooding back. The Seattle Times reports, quote, Marla Cooper, who lived in Spokane at the time, said she overheard LD Cooper say, "We did it, our money problems are over, we hijacked an airplane," end quote. She continues to recall her father was furious at his brother used the name Cooper, as he was sure every Cooper would now be investigated. The article goes on to say her father told her, quote, "Marla, this is very serious. You can never tell anybody what you have just seen," end quote. And he goes on to tell her that her uncle had done something horrible, but he didn't hurt a soul and he didn't get away with it, which she assumes was referring to how the money was missing. Now, the FBI did test DNA from Marla Cooper to some DNA found on that clip tie. However, it was not a match. And there was no way for them to know where the DNA on the tie actually came from. Was it a used tie? Was it handled by someone else? There are so many more fascinating stories of suspects and how different pieces of how they lived their lives could have led them to become the infamous Dan Cooper. Some people even believe that the FBI has already solved the case. Now, if this interests you, go for it. I want you to go online and get nerdy with the archives from the FBI files on their site, read all of the theories that they have to offer, and then come back and let me know in the comments section wherever you're listening. What do you believe happened? Who do you believe was DB Cooper? Thank you for being here. I'm your host, Jules. This is your host, Jules True Crime. If you enjoyed today, please consider leaving a 5-star review and rating wherever you're listening. It is so awkward to ask for. I will go ahead and say that, but it's one of the only ways us independent podcasters can grow and get pushed in the algorithm. So if you wouldn't mind considering taking a few moments to leave that 5-star review or rating, I would be very appreciative of that. But remember, no is a complete sentence. You need no further explanation. No, full stop. You're wanted, you're loved. You deserve to be here. And until next week, take care, guys. Bye. Hey guys, it's Jules. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, please rate and review wherever you are watching or listening. It sure helps me continue to grow and do what I'm doing here at your host, Jules True Crime. And we hope to see you back here next time. But until then, remember, no is a complete sentence. I'm your host, Jules. I'll see you later.
Fire Eyes Media.